Masechet Baba Kama Daf Lamed Aleph. We begin with a very interesting Mishnah. That's also quite relevant for driving too. Shnei kadarin shehayu mehalachin ze achar ze, v'nitkal harishon v'nafal, v'nitkal hasheni barishon. Harishon chayab v'nizkeh sheni. You have two potters who are walking, and naturally they're carrying pots. And they're walking in the middle of the street. It's a thoroughfare, and there's people constantly walking. You have to keep the traffic moving. But the potter that's in front fell. There was a bump in the road that he didn't see, and he tripped over it and fell. And then the guy right behind him didn't have enough time to react and stop, and tripped on the body of the first potter. In that case, the first potter is liable for any damages incurred by the second one, seemingly damages to his body and damages to the pots that the second guy was carrying. Okay, so this is relevant, like when there's a car pileup. The first guy stops short. Maybe there's something in the road, and for some reason he stops short, and then the second guy behind him doesn't have time to react and bangs into him. So, according to this, the first guy that stops short is responsible for damages for the guy behind him. And we'll see, and so on, if there's a third guy even behind him, who will be responsible. All right, so let's see what case this Mishnah is talking about. אמר רבי יוחנן, לא תמה מתניתין רבי מאיר היא, דאמר נתקל פושע הוא וחייב, אלא אפילו רבנן דאמרי אנוס הוא פטור, החייב שהיה לו לעמוד ולא עמד. Rabbi Yochanan says, do not interpret this Mishnah to be only the opinion of Rabbi Meir, who said, we saw the opinion of Rabbi Meir before, that someone who falls is negligent and liable. Rabbi Meir thinks that someone who's, when you're walking in the street, you are responsible for looking around you and seeing if there's any bump in the road, any obstacles. And if someone falls, it's their responsibility, right? If there's the sidewalk is uneven and the person is walking, so the person walking is responsible to look. And if by falling he causes damage to someone else, he is liable. So Rabbi Meir certainly is compatible. The first guy walking should have watched where he was going, and he didn't. He didn't see the bump. He fell. That caused the guy behind him to fall. So certainly, according to that, the first guy is responsible. But let's not limit the Mishnah only to the opinion of Rabbi Meir. And rather, even according to the Rabbanan, who say, someone that falls, it's beyond his control. People don't want to fall. You can't give a person the responsibility to walk so carefully that he has to take slow steps and watch everything. A person walks normally, and even normal walking, sometimes there's a bump that you don't see and you fall. It's not his fault. One is not called negligent just for falling. Even according to that opinion, in this case, the first potter would be liable. Why? Because he's not at fault for falling, but we do hold him at fault for not standing up right away. As soon as he fell, he should have quickly stood up. Okay, of course, we're not talking about a case where, he falls and breaks his arms and he can't get up. We're talking about a case where he stumbles, but he's okay. So you're in the middle of the street. There's traffic coming. So you gotta hurry up and keep moving. You can't just sit on the floor and wait around. You have to stand up. Because he didn't stand up right away when he could have, and that's what caused, that negligence caused the second guy to stumble over him, and that's why the first person is responsible. That's the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak amar afilu tema lo haya lo la'amod, haya lo lehazhir ve'lo hizhir. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak holds the first guy who fell even more responsible, and says even in a case where he didn't have time to stand up, right? It was just a couple of seconds that the guy behind him was right there, and impossible for him to stand up right away. Nevertheless, he is responsible because he should have warned. The first guy that fell should have called out and said, watch out, to the people behind him, so that they wouldn't trip over him. They may not be able to see because he's down on the floor and they're holding things and all that. So he's responsible for calling out right away. So in other words, if someone stops, the first guy stops short, the person who stops short is responsible to warn the people behind him. He should honk, put on his hazard lights, right? Do something to indicate to the people behind you that there is danger. And so if he doesn't do that, he's not responsible because he fell. Falling, this is according to Rabbanan, falling is beyond one's control. But according to Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, even though the first guy who fell, he's in distress himself right now, and he's trying to think about his fall and trying to get up. Nevertheless, before he gets up, even he's responsible to warn the people behind him. Now, Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Kevante lo haya lo la'amod, lo haya lo lehazhir. Rabbi Yochanan would respond to Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak and say, since he didn't have time to stand up, he also does not have a chance to warn people because he's preoccupied with standing up. Rabbi Yochanan says you can't, if someone's preoccupied with their own distress, you can't expect them to be thinking about others and warning others, right? It makes sense that the person will be thinking about himself right now. He just fell. Am I okay? Let me see if I can get up. And so you have to give him a chance. We don't hold him responsible. That means, according to Rav Nachman, even if someone is in distress about their own mishap, still he has a responsibility to think about others and danger that will happen to someone else. And he has a responsibility to warn. So therefore, Rav Nachman holds a person more responsible and therefore liable, even if he didn't have time to stand up. Whereas Rabbi Yochanan says, no, a person in distress is not responsible to warn others just yet. And if he doesn't have time to stand up, then he's not responsible. But if he had time to stand up himself and get his bearings right away and stand up, he needs to. He can't just sit on the floor and hang out there. Otherwise, he's responsible. All right, now that we understand the machloket, we're going to bring two challenges against Rabbi Yochanan. One from the very next Mishnah on the other side of the Amud. Tenan, other side of the daf. Ahia ba'al korah rishon uba'al chabit acharon. Nishbera chavit ba'korah patur. V'im amad ba'al korah chayav. You have someone that's carrying a beam. He's walking in front of someone who's carrying a barrel. Now, naturally, a beam is stronger, and if they knock into each other, the beam is going to break the barrel. And so, if in fact the barrel breaks because of the beam, the owner of the beam is not liable if they're continuing to walk. So we're talking about a case where the guy holding the beam is walking normally, no problem, and the guy carrying the barrel is walking too fast. And so he's going too fast and knocks into the beam in front of him. So that's his problem. This is like, someone's driving normally 25 miles an hour in front of you, and you're behind, and you are driving too fast, and you bang into the guy in front of you. Okay, so the guy in front is not liable in that case. However, im amad ba'al korah chayav, if the guy in front holding the beam stops in the middle of the thoroughfare and the guy holding the barrel bangs into him, then the one in the front is liable, right? That's like a car going here in the middle of the highway and the guy in front just decides to stop, right? We'll see why he's stopping. You can't stop in the middle of the highway, and the guy behind you bangs into you and causes and has damage to his car. The guy in front has to pay for the guy behind. Here too, the one holding the beam in front has to pay for the barrel in the back because he stopped walking in the middle of the street. Now, what case is this Mishnah? Ma'alav kshamad lechatef deorchehu vekatani chayav tava lehazhir. Why is he stopping? It must be he's stopping because he has the beam is falling. It's not balanced. And he's in distress, and so he's stopping so that he can adjust his load on his shoulder. And now this is a normal thing to do. This is normal behavior. People stop while they're going, and of course, if they need to do such a thing while they're carrying things. And nevertheless, he is liable. Why is he liable if he's doing something normal? Must be because he was supposed to warn, right? If you're in a highway and you need to stop for some reason, you have to put your hazard lights on. If you put your hazard lights on, then okay, the people behind have to know, and they have to stop, and you're not liable. But if you can put your hazard lights on, and you don't, and you're just stopping, even if it's you have a good reason to stop, and it's a normal thing to do, nevertheless, you're responsible if you don't warn the people behind you. So you see, this is a proof for Rav Nachman, that someone who is in distress, lechatef is in distress, about his own problem, nevertheless, he's responsible to warn the people behind him. And if he doesn't do so, he is liable. So this is a good proof for Rav Nachman against Rabbi Yochanan, And we answer, lo keshamad lafush. It doesn't say why he's stopping. Rabbi Yochanan could say he's stopping to rest. Now, stopping to rest is not a good enough reason to just stop in the middle of the street. Certainly not without warning the people behind you. A person who's stopping to rest is not in distress himself, but just he decides to rest. And that's why he could be walking, and instead he decides to stop. That's the same as someone who fell and can get up, but decides not to stand up. So that person is liable. That's the case that we're talking about. Okay, fine. We ask now to Rabbi Yochanan, aval amad lechatef mai patur. So according to you, if a person was in distress, then they stopped to adjust their load, then they would not be liable for breaking the jar of the guy behind him. Well, adetane sefa v'im amar lo bala chabit amod patur liflog bedida. B'medrim amorim keshamad lafush aval amad lechatef patur. Then look at the sefa of the Mishnah, the same Mishnah that we're going to see on the other side of the page, where the continuation gives a contrasting case, and we always want the two contrasting cases to be as close together as possible, without having to introduce any new factors, if as few as possible new factors. So the Sefa says, and if the guy, the one holding the beam in front, stopped and said to the guy behind him holding the barrel, stop, right? I'm stopping, right? Hold on. Then the one in front is not liable. So now why introduce a whole new factor that he's giving a warning? Why not talk about the very, very same case and say, when is it true that the one who in front who stopped is liable? Only when he stands to rest. But if he stops, when he stops to rest, but if he stops to adjust his load, then patur. Those cases would be very close together. And Rabbi Yochanan, according to you, that the cases where he stopped to rest, but if he would stop to adjust his load, then he'd be patur. So that would be a bigger chidush to tell me why you're introducing a new thing about warning the guy behind you. And Rabbi Yochanan can answer just fine. Hakamash malan dafagav damad lafushki kamalo lebalabai lebal chabit amod patur. No, in fact, the Mishnah wants to teach us this very important chidush, that even if you're stopping to rest, which is you're not in distress, nevertheless, if you warn the person behind you and say, hey, stop, then you're exempt. So this is a more important chidush that the Mishnah wanted to teach us. It might be even more obvious that if you're in distress, then and you stop, okay, that's not your fault. You have to think about your own load that's about to fall, and so then you're not expected to do it to warn anyone. And of course, there you're liable. And then this is actually the bigger chidush, that even if you're just stopping to rest, but you're not in distress, you can be, if you do that just without saying anything, you're chayav. But if you warn the person behind you, then you can do that. Even just to rest, right? A person just needs a break while they're driving. So as long as you put your hazard lights on and you stop in the middle of the street, take a nap, that's okay. And the person behind you does not have a right to just cannot bang into you. And if he does, you are not responsible because you warned him, and that's what the Mishnah is talking about. So Rabbi Yochanan is able to answer this question. Now we have a second challenge against Rabbi Yochanan. Ta'ashema, this is from a Baraita. Hakadarin v'hazaggagin shehayu mehalachin ze achad ze. So you have potters and glass makers, one holding pots, other holding glass, fragile items, and they're walking one behind the other. They're all walking in the street. Maybe they're going from their stores to the marketplace or wherever they're going. Nitkala rishon v'nafal, nitkala sheni barishon v'hashelishi b'sheni. Rishon chayav b'nizkeh sheni v'sheni chayav b'nizkeh shelishi. V'im mechamat rishon naflu, rishon chayav b'nizkeh kulam. That's the end of the Braita. So the guy in front fell down, and then the second guy after him trips on the first guy, and then the third guy trips over the second guy. The first guy is responsible for any damage that happens to the second guy, and the second guy is responsible for damages to the third guy. That's one case where they're falling like dominoes upon each other. However, if they all fell because of the first guy, we're going to see that means, let's say the first guy falls and sprawled across the the width of the street, and then the second guy trips over his legs, and the third guy trips over his head, and so on. So they all fall directly over the first guy. Then the first guy is responsible for damages to all of them. Okay, now let's ask the question. V'mizhiru ze et ze peturin. Oh, this is the sefa of the Baraita. But if they warn each other, if the first guy falls and says, right, fell, everybody stop, hold on, and the second guy warns the one guy behind him, right, everybody stop, then they are not liable. Okay, now we have to ask the question, my lav shelo haya lahem la'amod. Oh, we're not talking about a case where they didn't have the opportunity to stand back up. The first guy fell, and he couldn't stand up just yet, and nevertheless he is liable. So that's a proof for Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak that even though he could not have stood up, he should have, right as he's falling, or right when he fell, he should have warned the person behind him. And so you see here, even someone who is preoccupied because they're in distress, nevertheless has a responsibility to warn the person behind him, and otherwise he'd be responsible even if he didn't have time to stand up. And that's a challenge against Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabbi Yochanan can answer, Lo she'aya lahen la'amod. No, the Resha where it says that they are liable is when they had time to stand up, instead of standing up right away, because there's people right behind you. He decides to sit and rest over there. So the first guy sitting and resting, he is liable. Second guy sitting and resting when he could have had time to stand up, that's why he's liable. Ava lo haya lahem la'amod mai patur. Okay, Rabbi Yochanan, according to that, you're telling me that if they didn't have time to stand up, then they would not be liable. Well, let's see if that's compatible with the continuation. The sefa, that's going to bring a contrasting case that has the opposite outcome. Instead of bringing in a new factor that if the first guy warned after he fell and said stop, then he is not liable. Why introduce a new factor? Why not talk about the very same case and say, when is the first person who fell liable for the second, and the second liable to the third? Only if they had time to stand up. But if they didn't have time to stand up, then they would not be liable. That would be a closer case. And Rabbi Yochanan answers, actually the Mishnah wants to teach a bigger chidush. Hakamash malan, daf agav dahaya lahen la'amod, ki zhiru ze et ze peturin. Even if they had a chance to, had time to stand up, and nevertheless, if he decides that he wants to sit on the floor and rest for a while, as long as he warns the person behind him, he is patur. So yes, in fact, one would be patur. It could be patur in two ways. Either if you have time to stand up, but as long as you warn the person behind you, or if there's no time to stand up, even if you don't warn the person behind you, because this is according to the Rabbi Yochanan that says someone who is in distress about his own falling does not need. We cannot expect him to think about the person behind him and warn the person just yet. All right, so this Baraita also we are able to explain according to Rabbi Yochanan. Okay, next we have a statement about the details of this halacha. Amar Rava, Rishon chayav b'niskeh sheni, ben b'niskeh gufo, ben b'niskeh mamono. Sheni chayav b'niskeh shlishi, b'niskeh gufo, aval lo b'niskeh mamono. Rava teaches that when you have the first guy falls and then the guy after him, behind him falls on him, and the third guy falls on the second guy, the first person is liable both for damages that are caused by his own body, meaning the second guy tripped over his body, and he's also liable for damages caused by his own vessels. So if the first guy is holding a jar and the jar also falls while he's falling and breaks, and the second guy trips over the jar, then the first guy is liable. So we're taking ske gufo, remember we're taking the pronouns here, gufo and mamono, to refer to the first guy himself. he is responsible for damage caused by either his body or his vessels. Sheni, the second guy, however, is liable to pay for damages to the third guy, but only damage caused by his own body, not for damages caused by his property like his vessels. So we're going to have to try to figure out why. What's the difference between the first guy, who is more responsible than the second guy? So we ask, Mima nafshach, nitkal posheyahu sheni nami lechayev. If we consider people who fall to be negligent, they have to be more careful, then, well, that explains the first one. The first person who fell, since he is negligent, he's not considered a bod, but rather a person that damages with his own body. A human is always forewarned, and therefore, since he was negligent, he's totally liable, whether the damage comes from his body or from the vessels that he was negligent and caused to break. So that makes sense. But if so, then the second person also should be liable, because he's also someone who fell and was responsible. He should have kept more distance between himself and the person in front of him, and he should have been more careful and watched where he was going, and so on. And so he also should be considered negligent and posheya, liable, and therefore should pay even for damages caused by his vessels. If on the other hand you think that people who fall are not negligent, but it's honest, it's beyond their control, then the first person also should not be liable to damage caused by his vessels, but only by himself, because in that case we can consider him a bor, even though it's his body, but he fell just beyond his control. So now he's stuck in the middle of the street, and someone trips over him, so he's a bor. Fine, he's responsible for himself, but he would not be responsible for the vessels that fell and caused a bor not beyond his control, and that would apply to both. And so one or the other, right? Pick a lane, but either way, either they're both liable for everything, or they're both not liable for damage caused by their vessels. So we explain. In fact, Rishon Vadai Posheyahu, the first person that fell, we consider him negligent. There's a bump in the road, he should have seen it, and therefore he is liable fully to pay for damages caused by his body and for his property. Sheni agufo mechayev davalo la'amod lo velo amad amamona patur damale hay bera lav ana kirite. The second guy, however, is less liable, because it's not that he wasn't watching where he was going and to see a bump. He, beyond his control, tripped over the guy who was right in front of him. People can assume a flow of traffic. And so therefore, he's not going to be liable for his mammon, but he is liable for his body himself, because we're talking about a case where he could have stood up, and he didn't stand up, like we said before, according to the Yochanan. And so since he didn't stand up right away, so he's liable for his body. But for his property, he can say, "Oh, I didn't dig this pit, right? This pit was caused by the first guy," and therefore for the property can't get up by itself. And so you can't give responsibility, unlike the person himself, his body, he's fully responsible for. And he didn't break anything, he can stand up, then you got to stand up right away. But we can't blame him for the vessels, which he could say, "I didn't dig this pit. It was the first guy's fault that he is a pit, caused me to stumble, and therefore I'm not responsible for that." Okay, so now we have a conceptual understanding of Rava, but we have a textual problem from a baraita. Metibe kulam hayavin al niske gufan upeturin al niske mamon ma'lav afilu rishon. This baraita says that all of them, meaning all the people in the line, the first, second, third person, are liable for damage that happened with their body, but none of them have to pay for damage that was caused by their property. So that means they're all the same, and even the first guy, right? Doesn't that mean even the first guy does not have to pay for damage caused by his property? So we answer for Rava la lebar merishon. No, except for the first guy. Wait a second. Hakulam katari. This is everyone. That includes the first guy. Amar Ravada barava kulan hanizakin. You know what everyone means? Everyone who was damaged. The first guy was not damaged himself. He just tripped, but no one else caused him damage, just the pavement. So Hanizak Kulan means all those who were damaged. That means the second guy and third guy. They're the ones that have to pay for damage caused by their body, but not by their property. But the first guy has to pay even for the property. Is that a good answer? Hi, Mai, what are you talking about? Listen, if it means really everyone, including the first person, that's why it makes sense to say everyone. But if it means everyone but not the first one, then why would you use the word kulan? Say hanizakin, right? To be clearer. There's no reason to pick this with the word kulam if you actually mean nizakin. And therefore, we reject this explanation, this answer, and we're stuck with the challenge to Rava, that there is no difference here between the first and the rest, that the first also is liable only for damage caused by his body, but not caused by his property. Ela amar Rava. So we will adjust the statement of Rava to mean as follows: Rishon chayav ben b'niskei gufo desheni, ben b'niskei mamano desheni, v'sheni chayav b'niskei shelishi b'niskei gufo, aval lo b'niskei mamono. Rava actually is talking about not the object, the pronoun gufo is not referring to the first guy, but rather to the second guy, to mean as follows: the first person who fell is liable to pay for damage to either the body of the second guy behind him or the property of the second guy behind him. So now this can explain that baraita, because this Rava is not talking about the source of it, and he may very well say that it's only if the guy behind him trips over the body of the first, but not the first person's property. So that's what the baraita was talking about, which is the source. And so if the body of the first person causes the guy behind him to trip, so the first person has to pay for all the damages to the second person, whether he broke his arm or broke his jar. However, the second is liable to the third one only to pay for the third person's body for his broken arm, but the second guy does not have to pay for the broken jar of the third one. And so this is compatible with the Braita, because in all the cases, it's only referring to damage caused by a person's body, not a person's property, but the resultant damage to a person's body or property. Only the first one has to pay for both, but the second one only has to pay for his broken arm, not his broken jar. Now, for this understanding, okay, we can explain that baraita, but we still have to explain conceptually. Mai ta'ama? What's the reason for the difference between the first and the second? And the answer is dahavale bod velo masinu bod shechiye bod hakelim, because the second guy is a bod, and a bod is not liable for breaking vessels. Now, the first guy, that's considered his own body is causing damage, and he fell and is negligent for falling. So therefore, he is liable, just like a person with his own body either causes damage, any damage is responsible. Adam mu'ad le'olam, he's responsible for the body and the vessels of the second guy. That's because he's the one that fell and is negligent for falling, so that's considered a body. A person. But the second guy who fell not beyond his control, so he is considered only a bod. His body itself is a bod, and therefore a bod is liable for damaging people, but not for damaging vessels. All right, good. Now, all that explanation makes sense according to Shemuel, who said something is considered a bod no matter what, whether one keeps ownership over it or not. According to Rav, however, he said if you release ownership of the bod, then in fact you're not liable for vessels that fall into it. But if not, if you keep ownership, and in this case, certainly a person doesn't renounce ownership of his own body, and so since he keeps ownership of the bod, so then he's fully liable even for vessels that fall in. And if so, the second guy who is not renouncing ownership over his own body should be responsible to pay for the body and the vessels of the third guy. So what we said so far is good for Shemuel, but not good according to Rav. Le'olam kedamar meikara. So to explain Rav, well, you know what? We're going to go back to our original explanation of Rava as talking about the source of the damage, that the first person has to pay both for damages caused by his body and by his vessels. And the challenge that we had from the Braita, Udakash Yalan, Kulan Hayavin, the Braita that said there that the first person is responsible. And we understood that to mean responsible both for damage caused, responsible only for damage caused by his body, but not for his vessels. To the Gemara Rav Ada bar bin Yomi, Kamed Ravina Shuzku Kelim Bekelim. Oh, Rav Ada bar bin Yomi explained that this is referring to a case where both the source and the object of the damage was both vessels, and therefore the vessel is considered a board, and a board, one is not liable for other vessels. In other words, when the Braita says that even the first guy is liable only for damage caused by his body, but not for his vessels, that was not talking about a case where the damage is to the second guy's body. If it's damage to the second guy's body, then the first guy is liable no matter what the source is. Even if it's his vessels that the second guy tripped on, the first guy is in fact responsible, because that's his board, and the board he is liable for causing damage to a person's body. However, if and he would also be responsible if his body caused damage to vessels, because that's his body, and that's causing damage to vessels. So that's, yes, he's responsible. But that Baraita was talking about a case where it's the vessels of the first person that cause the guy to trip over them, and then and cause him to drop the second guy's vessels and break them. And so vessels to vessels, the first guy is not, none of them are responsible, because that is the first guy's board, and a board that damages vessels, he is not responsible. So that's what that Braita was talking about, only regarding damage damage to vessels caused by vessels. But otherwise, we can go back to Rava's first explanation, that the first guy is responsible for damage from both his body and his vessels, because he is more liable for tripping, whereas the second guy is not. Not this version, the earlier version, whereas the second guy is not, because his falling was beyond his control, so he's still liable for damage caused by his own body, but not by his vessels. Okay, and now we explain the rest of it. Amar Mor, im mechamat rishon naflu, rishon chaya b'nizkei kulam. So the Mishnah continued and said, if they all fell because of the first one, the first guy, then the first is responsible for everyone. In other words, the first case of the Mishnah was when it's Dominos, the first caused the second, and the second caused the third to trip over him. Then the first is responsible for the second, and the second is liable to the third. But if they all tripped over the first, then the first has to pay for the second, third, and so on. So how do you construct such a case? What exactly happened? Keshilda. Rav Zevid Amar kechutra de samyuta. Rav Papa explains that the first guy fell and blocked the whole road like a skeleton. I don't know, I guess skeletons, when they fall, they block the road. But the point is that he's stretched out like a skeleton, and he's filling the entire width of the road. And so one person comes and trips over his head, the other over his legs, and so they both trip over the first guy. So then the first guy is responsible for both. Or Rav Zevid gives a different analogy, like a blind man's cane. A blind man who's moving around his cane all over the place to see where he's going. So he moves in this direction and that direction and covers everything. And that would be the same thing as the first guy who falls and sprawled all over the place. He didn't fall just neatly straight ahead, and therefore caused directly the second guy and the third guy to trip. In that case, the first guy is responsible for all of them. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen ve'amen.